A little girl woke up after 3 months in a coma and whispered one name, Shaq. But when he arrives in town, a simple wish turns into a chilling revelation. A little girl's memory unlocks a 3-year-old mystery, exposing the truth no one wanted to face. An accident that wasn't an accident. A name spoken in fear. A town that must finally confront its past. What happens next will leave you stunned. Because some stories don't end. They wait to be uncovered. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Brookhaven wasn't a place that made headlines. It was one of those quiet American towns where people left their doors unlocked, where the biggest news was a new diner opening down the street. It was the kind of place where life moved at a slow, steady pace, and folks took pride in looking out for each other. But lately, Brookhaven had lost something. An invisible weight hung over the streets, a hush in conversations, a dimming of the warm lights that once glowed in shop windows. It wasn't just the cold wind curling around street corners or the early sunsets that made everything feel heavy. It was grief, the kind that settled deep, pressing into the bones of the town. It had been 3 months since the accident, since a little girl named Ellie Chambers had slipped into a coma. The intersection of Willow Street and Fordham Avenue had become a place of whispers, where people hesitated before crossing. It was just a simple 2-way stop, nothing special. But that night, something had gone wrong. A set of headlights, a sharp screech, a deafening crash, and then silence. Ellie was just 8 years old. She had been riding her pink bicycle home from the ice cream shop, laughing, the wind in her hair. Then everything changed. A car, a moment of bad luck or bad judgment. No one really knew the full story. The driver had vanished before help arrived. The only thing left behind was Ellie, broken and still, while her father screamed for someone, anyone to save her. Her parents, Luke and Valerie Chambers, had barely been seen since that night. They were shadows now, 2 people who once belonged to this town but had been swallowed whole by grief. The town had rallied at first. They raised money, held vigils outside St. Augustine Hospital, lit candles, and whispered prayers into the wind. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched into months, hope faded. The news stopped covering it. The hospital room became just another quiet place where time stood still. And one by one, people stopped asking. Because there were no answers. Brookhaven had always been full of life. But after Ellie's accident, something changed. The laughter of kids playing in the streets wasn't as loud. The little bookstore on Main Street, where Ellie used to sit on the floor flipping through picture books, seemed emptier. The town's heart still beat, but it was sluggish, tired. And then there was Shaquille O'Neal. Big Shaq, as the town called him, had never been just a celebrity to Brookhaven. Sure, he was a global icon, a towering legend, the kind of man who could turn heads just by walking into a room. But to the people here, he was more than that. He had bought a house on the outskirts of town a few years back, a quiet retreat from the madness of fame. And unlike other stars who hid behind gates and security teams, Shaq had walked right into their world, like he had always belonged. He ate at the local diners, sat at the counter with old-timers who didn't care about basketball, but loved a good conversation. He bought groceries for struggling families, slipped extra tips into the hands of waitresses who barely made enough to get by. He showed up at high school games, cheering the loudest, laughing with kids who couldn't believe a legend had stepped onto their gym floor. He had a way of making people feel seen, like their lives mattered. And maybe that's why Ellie had loved him, even though she had never met him. Her hospital room was covered in posters of him, pictures torn from magazines, little notes scrawled in shaky handwriting. Shaq is the best. Shaq helps people. One day I will meet Shaq. No one really knew where the obsession had started. Maybe it was because he was larger than life, a giant in both size and heart. Maybe it was because in her world of fairy tales, Shaq was the kind of hero who didn't need a cape. But it didn't matter now, because Ellie wasn't awake, and the doctors weren't hopeful. "You need to prepare yourselves," they had told her parents in hushed voices, avoiding eye contact. Her brain activity is minimal. Cases like this, they don't usually come back. Valerie had collapsed in the hallway. Luke had punched a wall so hard his knuckles bled. And then they had gone home to an empty house, to a little pink bicycle still leaning against the porch. The world moved on, but Ellie stayed frozen in time. Until, one morning, everything changed. It started as a whisper in the hospital. A nurse dropping her clipboard. A stunned gasp from an intern who had been checking vitals. A frantic call to the doctor. Ellie was moving. First, it was just a flicker of her fingers. Then her eyelids fluttered. And then, her lips parted, and a sound escaped. A name. A single word, quiet, barely there, but strong enough to shatter the silence that had held the room hostage for months. Shaq. The nurse almost didn't believe it. She leaned closer, brushing Ellie's tangled hair from her face. "Sweetheart, what did you say?" Ellie's lips moved again, voice hoarse, small, but certain. "I want to meet Big Shaq." The hospital erupted. Doctors flooded the room, checking monitors, whispering to each other in disbelief. Valerie and Luke arrived within minutes, breathless, eyes wide with both fear and hope. "Ellie?" Valerie sobbed, gripping her daughter's hand like she was afraid to let go. "Baby, can you hear me?" Ellie turned her head slowly, as if it took all the strength she had left, and gave a tiny, sleepy smile. "Shaq," she whispered again. "I have to meet Shaq." The doctors couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason why a child who had been unresponsive for 3 months had woken up like this. But Ellie didn't care about medical mysteries or scientific explanations. She had one wish. And Brookhaven, a town that had forgotten how to hope, suddenly had something to believe in again. That night, Ellie's story spread like wildfire. Social media picked it up first, a local journalist tweeting about the little girl who defied science with a single name. Then, news outlets ran the story. Soon, thousands of people were watching, waiting, praying. And somewhere, in a mansion miles away, Shaquille O'Neal's phone buzzed. He almost ignored it. But then, something made him stop. A picture. A little girl with bright eyes and a broken body, lying in a hospital bed. A name. Ellie Chambers. And a message that sent a chill down his spine. She woke up and the first thing she asked for was you. The moment Ellie opened her eyes, the world inside St. Augustine Hospital shifted. Nurses who had grown used to her silent room dropped their charts, their voices tangled in disbelief. Machines that had been monitoring an unchanging rhythm for months suddenly had something new to report. A single whispered breath of movement, a tiny flicker of life, after so long, after all hope had withered. Ellie Chambers was awake. Her mother, Valerie, was the first to collapse into sobs, her body racked with the weight of months of pain finally cracking open. Luke, her father, stood frozen, gripping the edge of her hospital bed as if touching her would make this moment real. Ellie was looking at them, really looking. Not through them, not past them, but straight into their eyes, her tiny, fragile chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. A doctor rushed in, his voice urgent, barking orders at the nurses, but none of the medical commotion mattered. The only thing that mattered was Ellie was back. Valerie smoothed Ellie's tangled blonde hair with shaking fingers. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Can you hear me?" Ellie blinked, slow and deliberate, her eyelids heavy. Then, her lips parted. A soft sound escaped, too quiet to make sense of at first. Valerie leaned in closer. "What, baby? What do you need?" Ellie's throat was dry, her voice barely a thread of sound, but she pushed the words out anyway. "I want to meet Big Shaq." The room stilled. Valerie's breath hitched, her husband's hands tightened against the bed frame. The doctor, still flipping through Ellie's charts, frowned. "Excuse me?" Ellie tried again, her voice hoarse but certain. "I want to meet Big Shaq." Valerie and Luke exchanged bewildered looks. Of all the things their daughter could have said, this made no sense. Ellie had never spoken about Shaquille O'Neal before. They had never watched basketball in their house, never mentioned him in passing. Luke swallowed hard. "Baby girl, what do you mean? Why him?" Ellie's eyes fluttered shut, exhaustion pulling at her, but her lips curled into the faintest, sleepiest smile. He helps people. The machines beeped steadily as she drifted back into rest, leaving everyone in the room reeling. The doctors didn't waste time. They were still too stunned to process anything beyond the medical miracle in front of them. A coma patient waking up after 3 months without warning? That was impossible. There were no medical signs of improvement, no gradual recovery, no precedent for this. But Ellie had done it. And all she had asked for in return was to meet Big Shaq. Word traveled fast. By nightfall, Brookhaven was buzzing. At first, it was just quiet talk, nurses whispering at the station, doctors shaking their heads in stunned disbelief. But then a hospital intern posted about it online. A little girl wakes up from a coma, and the first thing she asks for is Shaquille O'Neal. The internet picked it up like dry leaves in a wildfire. Ellie's story spread faster than anyone could control. Local news stations started calling the hospital, desperate for a quote. By morning, it had hit national news. Social media exploded with the hashtag #ShaqMeetEllie. Strangers, people who had never met Ellie, who didn't even know Brookhaven existed, were suddenly invested. "Somebody get this girl to Shaq," one person tweeted. "If Shaq doesn't meet Ellie, I'm losing faith in humanity," another wrote. Celebrities picked up the story. Journalists wrote about it. People started tagging Shaq himself. The town rallied behind the wish. Brookhaven, which had felt gray and lifeless for months, suddenly had something to fight for. Stores put up flyers. The local diner started giving out free coffee to anyone who posted about Ellie's wish online. Teachers at the elementary school asked kids to draw pictures of Shaq, promising to mail them out in hopes of catching his attention. Even the mayor, who usually only cared about re-election season, made a public statement, urging Shaq to come to Brookhaven. But through all the chaos, Valerie and Luke didn't know what to think. They had spent 3 months grieving their daughter. And now, in the span of a few hours, their world had flipped upside down. She was alive, awake, and somehow, impossibly, her first thought had been about a man they had never spoken about. "Why him?" Valerie asked Luke for the 100th time that day, as they sat beside Ellie's bed watching her sleep. Of all the people in the world. "Why him?" Luke shook his head. "I don't know. But if this is what she wants..." He exhaled sharply. "We have to try. Try." It was a simple word. But in that moment, it carried the weight of hope. And hope was something they hadn't allowed themselves to have in a long time. Brookhaven kept pushing. By the second day, news outlets were broadcasting Ellie's wish on national TV. By the third, a well-known talk show picked up the story. And by the fourth day, Shaquille O'Neal's phone buzzed with a notification he couldn't ignore. Somewhere in a sprawling mansion miles away, Shaq sat in his home office, scrolling through his phone. His timeline was flooded with messages. People tagging him, sending articles, videos, interviews. He clicked on one of the links. A news anchor's voice filled the screen. "A small town in Georgia has been fighting for the attention of one of the biggest names in basketball. 8-year-old Ellie Chambers, who miraculously woke up from a coma earlier this week, had just one request: to meet Shaquille O'Neal. Now the internet is demanding he answer her wish." Shaq leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He had gotten a lot of requests over the years. Thousands of fans had reached out, asking for everything from autographs to hospital visits to wedding appearances. But something about this one felt different. Shaq wasn't a man who ignored gut feelings, and right now, his gut was telling him that he needed to pay attention. So he clicked the video. Ellie's face filled the screen, a tiny girl, too pale, too fragile, lost in the tangle of hospital sheets. And then she spoke, her voice soft but so sure. "I want to meet Big Shaq." Something in his chest tightened. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. And then, without a second thought, he picked up his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, found his agent's number, and pressed call. "Find out everything you can about this little girl," he said the second the line connected. "I'm going to Brookhaven." Shaquille O'Neal had always believed in giving back. Some celebrities did it for the cameras, but for him, it was real. He had come from nothing, fought for everything, and now, He had the power to change lives, not just with money, but with his presence, his heart, his time. That day had been long, spent at a charity event in Miami. He had shaken hands, laughed with kids, signed a ridiculous number of basketballs, and left knowing he had made a difference. But now, as he sat in his quiet mansion, feet kicked up on the coffee table, phone in hand, scrolling through the flood of notifications, he felt a different kind of weight settle on him. The name Ellie Chambers kept popping up. At first, he barely skimmed past it. His timeline was always full of stories, requests, petitions asking for his attention. Most of them were genuine, heartfelt pleas. But he couldn't answer all of them. He was just one man. But then he saw the picture. A little girl, lost in a sea of hospital sheets. She looked fragile, too small, her skin pale from too much time in the shadows of sickness. But it wasn't the tubes, the wires, or the sterile white walls that made Shaq stop breathing for a second. It was her eyes. Even through the screen, they held something that hit him deep, in a place he didn't like to visit too often. There was hope in them. A belief so strong, so unshakable, it felt like she already knew. He would come. Shaq exhaled, rubbing a massive hand over his face. He clicked on one of the videos attached to the article. The news anchor's voice was calm, measured, but Shaq barely heard it. His eyes were on Ellie, on the way her lips moved, the way her voice, hoarse but steady, carried just one request. "I want to meet Big Shaq." Something tightened in his chest. This wasn't like the other requests. He knew it instantly. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. But he knew. Shaq sat forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the screen like it held some kind of answer he hadn't found yet. His phone vibrated again. A text from his agent. "Shaq, you're trending. Your Shaq Meet Ellie has hit 1 million mentions in under an hour. Let me know how you want to handle this." He didn't hesitate. He picked up his phone and made the call. His agent answered on the first ring. "Shaq, man, this thing is blowing up fast. You want a statement?" Shaq's voice was steady. "No statement." "Okay, so just tell her." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Tell her I'm coming." There was a pause on the other end. Then, his agent's voice softened. "All right, I'll make the arrangements." Shaq hung up. For a long moment, he sat in the quiet. Something wasn't sitting right. It wasn't just Ellie's face, her voice, or the overwhelming certainty in his gut. It was something else. A shadow of a memory, just out of reach, scratching at the edges of his mind. He closed his eyes, tried to pull it forward, but before he could grab hold of it, his phone buzzed again. The internet had exploded. By the time Shaq's message reached Ellie's family, Brookhaven was already on fire with excitement. The hospital lobby was packed with reporters. The nurses were overwhelmed with phone calls. Valerie and Luke Chambers couldn't keep up with the sheer number of messages flooding their phones. And Ellie? Ellie just smiled. She wasn't surprised. Not even a little. "He's coming," she whispered, her fingers curling around the hospital blanket. "I knew he would." Valerie pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. Luke just shook his head, somewhere between disbelief and awe. "Baby, how did you—" He stopped himself, exhaling shakily. "Never mind, it doesn't even matter." Ellie's tiny fingers reached out, grasping her father's wrist. "It does," she said softly. "Because I remember him." Valerie froze. "What do you mean, sweetheart? You've never met him." Ellie's eyes fluttered closed as if she were reaching into some deep, hidden part of her memory. "I have," she whispered. "A long time ago." Luke and Valerie exchanged a look. "Ellie, honey," Luke said carefully, "are you sure?" Ellie opened her eyes again, and this time, there was something heavy in them. Something that made Luke feel like maybe, just maybe, she knew more than she was letting on. "I'm sure," Ellie murmured. "Shaq was there that night." Valerie's stomach dropped. That night, the accident. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Before she could press her daughter further, a commotion erupted in the hallway. A nurse rushed in, breathless. "They just confirmed it," she said, practically glowing with excitement. "Shaquille O'Neal is coming to Brookhaven. He'll be here in 2 days." Ellie's smile widened. Valerie's heart pounded. And in the back of the room, Luke Chambers clenched his jaw, his mind racing with a sinking feeling he couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. Something wasn't right at all. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, Shaq sat in silence. His phone was buzzing with messages, notifications, calls. Everyone wanted a statement. But he didn't care about the media storm. His mind was somewhere else. On a night he had long since buried. A grocery store. A woman in tears. A little girl with big, hopeful eyes. And a man. A man whose face he couldn't quite remember. But who, somehow, felt connected to all of this. Shaq exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around his phone. "What am I walking into?" he muttered to himself. And for the first time in a long, long time, Shaquille O'Neal wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. The news spread like wildfire. Shaquille O'Neal was coming to Brookhaven. By the time his private jet landed at the small airport outside town, the streets were buzzing with a strange mix of excitement and unease. People stood outside their shops, peering through windows, whispering in hushed tones. Kids skipped school just to catch a glimpse of him. Even the old-timers who never cared for basketball sat outside the diner, eyes fixed on the road like something big was about to happen. Because it was. Shaq wasn't just another celebrity making a PR move. He wasn't rolling in with an entourage or flashing cameras. He was coming alone. No press, no handlers, just him. And for a town that had spent months drowning in tragedy, in whispered guilt and unresolved pain, his presence felt almost too big, too unreal. When his black SUV finally rolled down Main Street, everything stopped. People froze on sidewalks, coffee cups halfway to their lips, conversations cut short. Brookhaven, for the first time in a long time, held its breath. Shaq saw it all. The way people stared. The way they leaned into one another, murmuring things he couldn't hear but could definitely feel. They weren't just in awe of him. They were waiting. But for what? At St. Augustine Hospital, Ellie's room had become a war zone of emotions. Valerie paced near the window, wringing her hands, glancing outside like she expected to wake up from all this. Luke sat in the corner, elbows on his knees, silent but stiff. His jaw twitched every few seconds, his fingers tapping against his legs in some quiet rhythm of tension. Ellie, however, was calm. She sat in her hospital bed, her tiny hands folded in her lap, watching the door like she had already seen this moment happen before. And then, the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Valerie froze. Luke's fingers curled into fists. And Ellie just smiled. The door opened. And there he was. Shaquille O'Neal. It didn't matter how many times people had seen him on TV, in interviews, or even in person at a game. Nothing prepared you for how big he was. He filled the doorway completely. A 6'11" shadow, his presence making the small hospital room feel even smaller. But when he stepped inside, there was no arrogance, no larger-than-life celebrity energy. Just quiet, just him. And then, the tension. Thick, unspoken, almost suffocating. Shaq felt it immediately. The way Valerie clutched the armrest of her chair, the way Luke wouldn't meet his eyes. Even the nurses in the hallway had gone silent. Something wasn't right. But his eyes weren't on them. His eyes were on Ellie, and hers, locked onto his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice so soft it barely carried, Ellie whispered, "You remember me, don't you?" Shaq's heart stopped. The room disappeared. The hospital walls, the beeping machines, the weight of 1,000 eyes watching him. It all blurred into the background. Because suddenly, he was there again. Not in this hospital room. Not in Brookhaven. But in a grocery store, years ago. It was raining that night. Shaq had been on his way out of town, just another pit stop in a small place he barely remembered the name of. He stopped at a local grocery store for snacks, something quick before hitting the road. And that's when he saw her. A woman at the checkout counter, fumbling through her purse, face flushed with embarrassment. Her daughter, a tiny thing with bright eyes and wild blonde hair, stood beside her, clutching a stuffed bunny. Shaq didn't mean to eavesdrop, but it was hard not to hear when the cashier said, in a cold, flat voice, "Ma'am, your card declined." The woman panicked, scrambling through her purse, pulling out crumpled bills, counting change with shaking hands. I just need the milk," she had stammered. "And the bread. Please, just—" The cashier sighed. "Look, lady, I can't—" Shaq stepped forward. "Put it all on me," he said, pulling out his card before the woman could protest. The cashier blinked. The woman froze. No, she started, shaking her head, eyes glassy with humiliation. "I can't." Shaq just smiled. "You can, and you will." The little girl beside her beamed up at him. "Are you a giant?" she asked. Shaq laughed. "Nah, just big-boned." She giggled. Her mother, eyes wet, murmured, "Thank you. I mean it. Thank you." Shaq just nodded, and then, as he turned to leave, the little girl called out, "I won't forget you." Ellie had been that little girl, and Shaq had forgotten, until now, until she had forced him to remember. His breath hitched. The past came rushing back so fast it left him unsteady. "That was you," he whispered. Ellie nodded, her tiny fingers curling into the sheets. "That was me." Valerie's hand clamped over her mouth. Luke, silent, tense Luke, stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "You knew her," he said, his voice low, sharp. Shaq turned to him, and for the first time he realized this tension wasn't just about Ellie's wish. This was about something more, something deeper, something dangerous. Because Luke wasn't just looking at him like a grateful father. He was looking at him like a man who knew something Shaq didn't. And suddenly, the room felt a little too small. Shaq turned back to Ellie. Her eyes, still bright, still holding that same unshakable belief, bore into him like she was waiting for him to see what she already knew. "Why did you ask for me, Ellie?" he asked quietly. Her lips curled into the smallest, knowing smile. "Because," she whispered, "you were meant to come back." The air in the room shifted, and in that moment Shaq realized this wasn't just about a little girl's wish. This was about unfinished business. And whatever was waiting for him in Brookhaven, it was far from over. Life wasn't about the big wins, the trophies, or the millions in his bank account. It was about those small, fleeting moments, the ones that passed in the blink of an eye, but stayed with you forever. That night in the grocery store had been one of those moments. A woman struggling to pay for a few basic groceries. A little girl with bright eyes and messy blonde hair, clutching a stuffed bunny like it was the only thing she owned. He had stepped in, barely thinking about it, covered the bill, shared a quick laugh with the kid, and then he had walked away, convinced it was just another small, forgettable act of kindness. But now, standing in Ellie's hospital room, staring into those same bright eyes, he knew he had been wrong. That moment hadn't been small. It had been everything. And as he looked at Ellie, at her mother Valerie, at the raw tension in Luke's stiff posture, something deep in his chest shifted, because there was more, something he had forgotten, and it was waiting for him in the shadows. Shaq barely slept that night. Brookhaven was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, too still, like the town itself was holding its breath. The hotel room they had arranged for him was nice enough, but he couldn't shake the feeling of something unsettled curling around the edges of his thoughts. He lay on the too small bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the memory that wouldn't come fully into focus. The grocery store, the woman, Valerie, the little girl, Ellie, and then something else. Someone. Shaq sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. It had been just before he left the store. He had turned toward the exit, but before he could walk out, another man had stepped in. A man with tired, sunken eyes and a nervous twitch in his jaw. Shaq hadn't thought much of him at the time. Just another guy, probably in a hurry, shoulders hunched against the cold. But now, years later, the image of that man pressed against his memory with unsettling force. Because suddenly, Shaq wasn't so sure that man had just been another stranger. What if he had been something more? Something connected. The next morning, Shaq drove back to the hospital. He wasn't scheduled to visit again until later, but he didn't care. Something was pulling him there. When he walked into Ellie's room, she was awake, propped up against a sea of pillows, the steady beeping of machines filling the space around her. She smiled when she saw him. "I knew you'd come early." Shaq pulled up a chair beside her bed, resting his forearms on his knees. "Yeah? How'd you know that?" Ellie shrugged, but there was something knowing in her expression. "Because you feel it too, don't you? The unfinished part." Shaq's stomach tightened. This kid. She wasn't just smart, she knew things. Shaq exhaled. "Ellie, I need to ask you something." She nodded, like she had been waiting for this. "When I met you and your mom that night, was there anyone else there?" Ellie's small fingers twisted in the fabric of her blanket. She hesitated. Then in a quiet voice she said, "Yes." Shaq's pulse kicked up. "Who?" She swallowed hard. "A man. I don't know his name, but I remember his face." Shaq leaned in. "Ellie, I need you to think real hard. Do you remember anything about him? What he was wearing? What he said?" Ellie's eyebrows furrowed. "He was wearing a brown jacket. His eyes were weird, like he hadn't slept in a long time." Shaq's breath hitched. She was describing the same man he had seen that night. The memory slammed into him all at once. The grocery store door had swung open, cold wind rushing in. The man had stepped inside, shoulders hunched, head down. He had brushed past Shaq, barely acknowledging him. But now Shaq remembered something else. The way the man had glanced toward the checkout line. The way his gaze had landed on Valerie and Ellie. The way his fingers had twitched at his sides, like he was waiting for something, like he had been watching them. And then, the accident. The car that had hit Ellie. The driver who had disappeared. The face no one had ever seen. Shaq's stomach dropped. No, it couldn't be. But the pieces were fitting together too well. The man from the grocery store. He had been there the night of the accident. And suddenly, Shaq knew. This wasn't just an accident. This was something bigger, something darker. Something that had started years ago, and he had been there for the beginning of it. Ellie watched Shaq carefully. "You remember now, don't you?" she said softly. Shaq swallowed hard. "Yeah," he murmured. "I do." Ellie exhaled, like she had been waiting for this. "I think he was looking for my mom that night." Shaq's fingers curled into fists. "Ellie," he said slowly, "does your mom know this?" Ellie hesitated. "I don't think so." Shaq nodded. He needed to talk to Valerie. Now. But just as he stood, the door swung open. Valerie and Luke stepped inside. And the look on Valerie's face told him she knew, more than she had ever let on. She looked between Shaq and Ellie, eyes flicking with something close to fear. "You remember," she whispered. It wasn't a question. Shaq held her gaze. "I remember the man." Luke stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Who is he?" Valerie's entire body tensed, and Shaq saw it. The way she knew. The way she had always known. Shaq took a step closer. "Valerie, tell me the truth." Her throat bobbed, her fingers curled into the hem of her sweater. And then, she broke. "His name is Derek Cole," she whispered, "and he wasn't supposed to find us." Shaq's heart slammed against his ribs. This was bigger than he thought. Bigger than Ellie's accident. Bigger than anything he had expected. And now, it was too late to walk away. Brookhaven had always been a town where secrets didn't stay buried for long. Word traveled fast. Too fast. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the news had spread from one side of town to the other, Shaquille O'Neal remembered. And that meant something dangerous. Because there was one man in Brookhaven who had spent years trying to forget. Derek Cole. He had been a ghost in his own town for the past 3 years. Living in the outskirts, keeping to himself, pretending the whispers and the sideways glances didn't sting like open wounds. He hadn't always been this way. There was a time when Derek was just another face in the crowd, a man who worked hard, kept his head down, and minded his own business. But that was before the accident, before Ellie Chambers, before the night everything went wrong. Now, Derek was something else entirely. A name people spat out in hushed tones. a presence that made conversations die mid-sentence, a walking reminder of guilt, grief, and unanswered questions. And tonight, as he sat in the dimly lit bar on the edge of town, nursing a drink he had barely touched, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Panic. Because Shaq wasn't just passing through. Shaq was here for answers, and Derek was part of them. Shaq could feel it the second he stepped outside the hospital. The weight in the air. Brookhaven wasn't big, but tonight it felt even smaller. The streets were quieter than they should have been. Conversations stopped when he walked past. People turned their heads, some pretending not to stare, others not bothering to hide it. Shaq had been around long enough to recognize the signs. This wasn't excitement, this was fear. A tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. And now, it was rising, bubbling over, threatening to spill into something that couldn't be controlled. And at the center of it all, Derek Cole. Shaq didn't know the full story yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Derek was the reason Ellie was in that hospital bed. Whether it was his fault or not, that didn't matter. What mattered was the town had already decided. And Ellie's father? Luke was barely holding himself together. Luke Chambers had always been a quiet man. The kind of father who taught through actions, not words. Who kissed his daughter on the forehead every night and made sure the porch light was always on when she played outside. But ever since the accident, something inside him had cracked. The grief had eaten away at him. The sleepless nights, the unanswered questions, the rage with nowhere to go. For 3 years, he had buried it. But now, Shaquille O'Neal had walked into town and dug up everything Luke had spent years trying to forget. And Luke wasn't sure if he wanted to say thank you or start a fire that couldn't be put out. Because Derek Cole was still breathing. Still walking around this town like he hadn't stolen everything from him. Valerie had begged him to let it go. Told him that Derek wasn't the one behind the wheel that night. That some things didn't have answers. But Luke couldn't accept that. Because someone had put his daughter in that hospital bed. And if Derek wasn't guilty, then why had he run? Derek felt the shift before he saw it. The bar had been quiet all night. A few regulars mumbling over their drinks. The hum of an old radio filling the empty space. But then the door opened, and everything stopped. The bartender froze mid-pour. Conversations died, and Derek didn't need to turn around to know who had just walked in. Luke Chambers. Derek gripped the edge of the bar, his pulse pounding. He had known this moment would come. He had spent 3 years waiting for it. He just hadn't expected it to happen tonight. Not with Shaquille O'Neal in town. Luke's voice was low, controlled, but dangerous. "We need to talk." Derek swallowed hard. "I don't think we do." Luke took a slow step forward. Then another. "You should have left town when you had the chance," he murmured. Derek finally turned, meeting Luke's stare. "I tried," he said, his voice rough. "But some ghosts don't let you go." Luke's eyes darkened. "You don't get to talk about ghosts." Derek knew what was coming next. The accusations, the rage, the demand for answers he couldn't give. But before Luke could say another word, a new shadow filled the doorway. Shaq. The room shifted again. It wasn't just about Luke and Derek anymore. Now, Shaq was part of it too. And whatever was about to happen, he wasn't going to let it end the way the town wanted it to. Shaq had seen a lot in his lifetime. Fights, anger, the ugliness that came from pain that had nowhere to go. And right now, he saw all of it in Luke's eyes. Shaq stepped between them, his presence like a wall of steel. "This isn't the way," he said, his voice calm but firm. Luke's jaw tightened. "You don't understand, Shaq." Shaq held his stare. "Then make me." Luke's chest rose and fell, anger shaking his entire body. "He knows something," he ground out. "And he's been hiding it for years." Shaq turned to Derek, his gaze sharp. "Is that true?" Derek's throat bobbed. His eyes darted toward the door like a man thinking about running. Shaq's voice dropped, low and serious. "Don't." Derek went still. Shaq took a step closer. "If you walk away now, that means you got something to hide." The entire bar was watching. Derek exhaled slowly, and then finally he spoke. I wasn't driving the car that hit Ellie, he said. His voice was hoarse but steady. But I know who was. Luke's breath caught. Shaq's pulse pounded. And for the first time in 3 years, Brookhaven was about to hear the truth. Outside, the wind picked up. The town had waited a long time for this moment, and it wasn't ready for what was coming next. Derek Cole had finally spoken, and what he said changed everything. By morning, the whole town was talking. Derek wasn't the one who hit Ellie, but he knew who did, and that was enough to set everything on fire. Some people whispered about forgiveness, that if Derek had been carrying this secret for years, maybe, just maybe, he had suffered enough. Others? They wanted blood. He covered for someone, they said, voices sharp, angry. He let Ellie's family suffer all this time. He didn't say a word. That makes him guilty too. By noon, the town was split. Neighbors turned cold toward each other. Old friendships strained under the weight of a truth too big to ignore. And at the center of it all? Luke Chambers. Luke was drowning. For 3 years, he had lived with one version of the truth. Derek Cole was the reason Ellie had almost died. Derek was the man he had cursed under his breath, the name he had bitten into every time his wife told him to let it go. But now Derek wasn't the villain. And that meant Luke's rage had nowhere to go. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't breathed right since last night, because Derek knew who was behind the wheel. And he had chosen silence. The thought burned. Luke's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel of his truck, parked outside the bar where Derek had last been seen. He needed answers. No cameras, no reporters, no Shaq stepping in to calm things down. Just the truth, even if it destroyed him. The bar was nearly empty when Luke stepped inside. Derek sat in the farthest booth, staring into a glass of something untouched. He looked wrecked. Good. Luke's boots echoed against the floor as he walked forward. Derek didn't look up. Tell me, Luke said. His voice was too calm. Derek exhaled slowly. Luke. Say the name. Derek's fingers tightened around the glass. You don't want this. Luke's chest heaved. Say, the damn name. A pause. And then, Raymond Holt. Luke's stomach dropped. It felt like his entire world had been punched out of place. Raymond Holt, his friend, his business partner. The man who had stood beside him at Ellie's bedside, comforting him, telling him that justice would come. Raymond had been driving the car that night. Luke felt his vision tilt. You're lying, he whispered. Derek's eyes darkened. I wish I was. Luke's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. Raymond had been at their house, at the prayer vigils. Raymond had held Valerie when she cried. And all this time, he had been the reason Ellie almost died. I trusted him. Luke's voice cracked. Derek nodded slowly. We both did. And that was the final straw. Luke snapped. He lunged, grabbing Derek by the front of his shirt, slamming him against the table. Chairs scraped, glass tipped. The few people in the bar gasped, but no one stepped in. Because this was a storm that had been coming for years. You let me think it was you, Luke hissed, his voice shaking with something beyond rage. Derek didn't fight back, didn't try to push him off. Because in his heart, he agreed. I know, Derek murmured. I should have said something. You should have told me before I wasted 3 years hating the wrong man. The words echoed through the bar. Derek clenched his jaw. I was scared, Luke. You know what Raymond is capable of. Luke's grip tightened. And what if he had killed her? Would you still be scared then? Derek's silence was answer enough. Luke's fist curled. And for the first time in his life, he felt the urge to let it all out, to throw the punch, to make someone else feel the weight of his suffering. But before he could, a giant hand caught his wrist. Shaq. The room shifted. Shaq's voice was low, firm, unshakable. This ain't the way. Luke was breathing hard, his body shaking with everything he couldn't say. You don't get it, Shaq, he gritted out. Shaq's grip on his wrist didn't budge. Yeah, he said. I do. Luke laughed bitterly. Number you don't. Shaq's eyes darkened. You think I ain't never been where you are right now? He said. You think I don't know what it's like to have rage sitting in your chest, eating you alive? Luke's breath hitched. Shaq's voice dropped lower. If you fight hate with hate, who wins? The words slammed into Luke like a freight train. His chest heaved, his fingers trembled. And slowly, so painfully slowly, he let go of Derek's shirt. Then, a voice, software small, but filled with enough power to stop everything. It wasn't an accident. The entire bar froze. Luke turned slowly. Ellie stood in the doorway. Her hospital gown hung loose on her fragile frame, her tiny hand gripping Valerie's for support. But her eyes were clear, sharp, certain. It wasn't an accident, she repeated, stronger this time. Luke's heart stopped. Shaq exhaled sharply. Ellie, Valerie whispered, tears in her voice. Sweetheart, what do you mean? Ellie looked between them all, at her father, at Derek, at Shaq, and then she said something that shattered everything. I remember the night I got hit, she whispered, and I remember what Raymond said. Shaq's pulse kicked up. What did he say, Ellie? Ellie swallowed hard. He said, she's seen too much. A stunned silence, and just like that, everything changed. Because Ellie hadn't been hit by accident. She had been targeted. And now, for the first time, Brookhaven knew the truth. A heavy silence filled the bar. Ellie's words hung in the air, wrapping around everyone like an invisible noose. She's seen too much. Shaq's pulse pounded. Luke's fingers curled into fists. Derek went completely still. No one moved. No one breathed. Because in an instant, everything had changed. Ellie hadn't been hit by accident. She had been targeted. And the man responsible for it had been hiding in plain sight the whole time. Valerie tightened her grip on Ellie's hand. Sweetheart, she whispered, her voice wavering. Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure that's what you heard? Ellie's small fingers curled into the fabric of her gown. She nodded. I remember now, she said, soft but steady. I remember everything. Shaq exhaled sharply. Ellie, he said gently, I need you to walk us through it. Tell us what happened that night. Ellie looked up at him, her wide eyes full of something too heavy for a child to carry. She took a deep breath. And then, she started talking. It was raining, she whispered. I was riding my bike home from the ice cream shop. I wasn't supposed to be out that late, but Mom said I could if I promised to be careful. She glanced at Valerie, guilt flickering in her expression. Valerie squeezed her hand, eyes brimming with unshed tears. At the stoplight, Ellie continued, I saw a car parked across the street. The headlights were off, but I could still see someone sitting inside. Her fingers twisted in her blanket. It was him, she said. It was Raymond Holt. Luke's body went rigid. Ellie swallowed. I didn't think anything of it at first, but then the door opened, and he got out. Shaq leaned forward, his voice low, steady. Did he say anything to you? Ellie nodded. Her breath hitched. He said, Hey kid, shouldn't you be home? And I told him I was just leaving. She hesitated. And then the fear crept into her voice. That's when I saw Derek. The entire bar shifted. Derek's breath caught. I was there? Ellie nodded. You were across the street. I remember because you looked nervous. You kept looking between me and Raymond like you knew something was wrong. Derek froze. And suddenly, it came back to him. That night. The rain, the headlights, the unease curling in his stomach. Derek had been on his way home when he saw Raymond Holt standing on the sidewalk, talking to a little girl. Ellie. Something about it had felt off. Raymond wasn't a man who made casual conversation. He was calculating, precise. And when he had glanced up and locked eyes with Derek, that was when Derek had understood. Raymond wasn't just talking to Ellie, he was waiting. And then, the car. The roar of an engine. The sudden blur of headlights barreling toward Ellie. Derek had moved without thinking. He had shouted her name, sprinted toward the street. But he had been too late. The car slammed into her, her tiny body flung into the air, and then everything went black. Derek's chest heaved. His hands shook. "Oh my God," he whispered. "I tried to stop it." Ellie nodded. "You did," she said softly. "You ran toward me. You tried to help." Shaq exhaled sharply. "Derek," he said carefully. "Who was in the car?" Derek's throat bobbed. His fingers dug into his knees. "Raymond," he whispered. "It was Raymond." Luke staggered backward. His world tilted. "That son of a—" He choked on the words, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. Shaq reached out, steadying him. "Easy," he murmured. Luke's chest rose and fell violently. He sat in my house. He prayed for my daughter. His voice broke. Valerie covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I trusted him," Luke whispered. Derek clenched his jaw. "So did I." A new kind of silence filled the bar. Not just shock, not just anger, realization. For 3 years, the town had whispered about Derek, had cast him as the villain. But now they knew. They had been wrong. The real villain had been hiding among them, smiling, shaking hands, pretending to be something he wasn't. And now there was no more hiding. Shaq took a slow breath. "Where is he now?" he asked. Derek's eyes darkened. "If I had to guess," he said quietly, "he's watching. And he knows his time just ran out." For 3 years, Brookhaven had been living in a lie. It had been whispered in grocery aisles, murmured in church pews, and buried beneath forced smiles at town gatherings. Derek Cole. The man they had all blamed. The man they had shunned, avoided, cursed under their breath. But now they knew the truth. And the weight of it settled over the town like a long overdue storm finally breaking. Raymond Holt had been one of them. A trusted friend. A neighbor. A man who had held Ellie's hand in that hospital room, sitting beside a child he had nearly killed. And all this time, they had let the wrong man carry the guilt. Derek stood outside the bar, staring at the cracked pavement beneath his feet. He didn't know what to feel. Relief? Anger? Or just exhaustion? The town had turned its back on him, made him an outcast, a ghost in his own home. And now? Now they would look at him with pity instead of hate. He wasn't sure which one was worse. The door creaked behind him. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Then, a hand on his shoulder. Derek tensed. And then, Luke Chambers spoke. "I was wrong." Luke had never been a man of many words. He had built houses with his bare hands, raised a daughter with love and quiet strength. But when it came to emotions, he struggled. But now, standing in front of the man he had spent 3 years hating, words were all he had left. "I should have known," Luke said, his voice thick, rough. "I should have seen it." Derek swallowed hard. "It wasn't your fault." Luke's chest heaved. "Wasn't it?" His eyes glazed over with something unreadable. "You lost everything because of me." Derek hesitated. Then slowly, he shook his head. "I lost everything because of Raymond." Luke's throat bobbed. The silence stretched too long, too heavy. Then, he held out his hand. Derek stared at it. For a long moment, he didn't move. And then, he took it. The past didn't disappear in that moment. The wounds didn't heal instantly. But for the first time in years, Brookhaven took a breath. And it felt lighter. The town shifted. The weight of guilt, of misplaced anger, of an entire community carrying a secret it never knew it had. It all began to lift. People murmured apologies. They stopped averting their eyes when Derek walked past. And for the first time in years, Derek didn't feel invisible. Shaq watched it all unfold. He had been in Brookhaven for just a few days, but somehow this town had settled into him, wrapping around his chest in a way that felt almost permanent. He had come here for Ellie, for a wish, a moment. But now, as he looked at the town, at the way it was learning to heal, he realized something else. He had been meant to come here. Maybe not for Ellie. Maybe not for Derek. Maybe for all of them. The sun had set. The town had exhaled. And inside the hospital, Ellie was waiting. Shaq stepped into her room, ducking slightly under the doorframe, his presence as big as ever. She smiled at him. "I was starting to think you'd leave without saying goodbye." Shaq chuckled, pulling up a chair. "Not my style, kid." Ellie tilted her head. "Then what is your style?" Shaq smirked. "Helping people who don't even know they need help." Ellie nodded like she had already known the answer. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have one last wish." Shaq leaned in. "Lay it on me." Ellie's fingers curled in her blanket. "I want to walk with you," she said softly. "Outside, under the streetlights." Shaq's breath caught. Ellie had been in a hospital bed for months, weak, healing, fighting, and now, she wanted to walk. Shaq studied her carefully. Then, he grinned. "Well," he said, "what are we waiting for?" The nurses warned them. Valerie almost refused. But Ellie was determined. With slow, careful steps, she made her way outside. Shaq kept his hand near her, not touching, but close enough to catch her if she needed it. The town was quiet. The streetlights cast a soft golden glow over the sidewalks, the shadows stretching long behind them. Ellie tilted her head back, breathing in the night air. "I forgot how this felt," she whispered. Shaq smiled. "Good, huh?" Ellie nodded. They walked in silence for a while. Then, she stopped, turned to face him, and in the soft glow of the streetlights, she said the words that would stay with him forever. "You didn't just come here for me," she said. Shaq's chest tightened. Ellie smiled. "You came here for everyone." Shaq exhaled, and he knew she was right. The next morning, Shaq packed his bags. Brookhaven had healed, not completely, not perfectly, but it had taken its first step, and that was enough. As he stepped into his SUV, the town gathered to see him off, not as a celebrity, not as an outsider, but as part of their story. Ellie stood beside her parents, waving. Shaq smiled, rolled down the window, and with one last look at Brookhaven, he said exactly what they needed to hear. "Y'all take care of each other now." Then, he drove away. And as the town faded in the rearview mirror, Shaq knew deep in his heart he had been meant to be here. Some stories stay with you long after they end. This is one of them. What would you have done if you were in Brookhaven? If truth, justice, and redemption were in your hands? The conversation isn't over. It's just beginning. Stay curious. Stay watching. Because sometimes the past isn't buried. It's waiting to be uncovered.